Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I return with a review of a book I first read several years ago, when the Black Lives Matter riots were sweeping through cities across the nation after the death of George Floyd. It was around this time that an obscure group of black-clad domestic terrorists were becoming a household name: Antifa. I became increasingly interested in them, especially as the more mainstream news and politicians tried to downplay their behavior or pretend they didn't exist, as with the infamous CNN chyron detailing a reporter in front of a raging building fire as a fiery but mostly peaceful protest. And this is a line that often gets repeated with these types of militant activists, insisting that they are mostly peaceful, a description that seemingly ignores the equivalent statement of sometimes violent. Point this out, and Antifa's defenders will come out with dozens of excuses on how they are only violent in self-defense, a position I will discuss in greater detail later in this video. But first, I want to come to a better understanding of who and what they are, and from their own perspective, and hence this book, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray. What this book and review will be able to do is dive into the outlook and mindset of this organization, to try and understand their motivations. But Bray is a radical activist, and doesn't try to hide it. He describes the book as an unabashedly partisan call to arms. For a more clear-eyed view of Antifa and their behavior, you'll need to look elsewhere. I'm not trying to provide a comprehensive overview of Antifa in this video, but I can provide some resources for further investigation. The recognized expert on Antifa is journalist Andy Ngo, a man who has spent much of his career documenting American Antifa, and who has been attacked and beaten by them as a result. His Twitter feed is an excellent source of information, as well as his book on the subject, Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. He has also done numerous interviews that are well worth watching. Another book I would suggest is Unmasking Antifa, 5 Perspectives on a Growing Threat, which is a collection of testimonies and articles about Antifa from a variety of crime and national security experts. Finally, I would suggest reading the surprising amount of literature available online from Antifa and related groups, keeping in mind the intended audience. Stuff they put out for general public consumption is unreliable, but material that is intended for other activists can be quite illuminating. I'll provide links for the books below the video. Returning to this particular review, we are presented with the first and most basic question: what exactly is Antifa? Bray spends a significant portion of the introduction trying to answer this question, everything from the obviously reductionist opposition to fascism to the somewhat more useful explanation of a method of politics, a locus of individual and group self-identification, and a transnational movement that adapted pre-existing socialist, anarchist, and communist currents to a sudden need to react to the fascist menace. But I think the best definition actually comes much later in the book, after he is finished trying to play obscurative word games, when he states that, quote, "Anti-fascism is pan-revolutionary left politics, applied to fighting the far right," end quote. That's about as definitive as it gets. That quote also gives us the best definition for fascism that we're going to find in this book. Fascism equals far right. So what is far right? That is never really made clear, but can probably be summarized as all of the bad things, at least as someone involved in left-wing politics would describe. So racism, sexism, homophobia, and oppression in all of its forms. We've heard this before. He may have as well said the forces of darkness instead of fascism, because there are definitely quasi-religious undertones to his position. At one point, he quotes a leftist historian who states that, quote, "One cannot be balanced writing about fascism. There is nothing positive to be said about it," end quote. So Antifa is a group of holy crusaders on campaign against everything that they see as wrong with the world. So what is their positive vision? That too is complicated, as they view themselves as the vanguard of left-wing politics, and don't concern themselves with the various after-the-war issues. They are a hodgepodge of different approaches to left-wing politics, as can be seen in their iconography. The twin flags are one of the most common pieces of anti-fascist symbolism, but the coloring can tell a lot about the particular Antifa cell. Black is anarchy, red marks socialism, pink queerness, purple feminism, etc. Sometimes emblems are included, like the Black Power fist or the symbols of an independence movement. A combination of black and red are the most common, indicating anarcho-socialism. Now, while these are the expressed beliefs of the anti-fascist, When it comes down to it, I have identified two main pillars of anti-fascist thought that underpin their ideology. The first is neo-Marxism, and the second is postmodernism. Now, the keen listener may note that these are not particularly compatible modes of thought. Marxism and its variants assert a grand narrative, whereas postmodernism rejects the idea of a definitive grand narrative. While this is true, don't expect much intellectual consistency going forward. Both pillars have their place in anti-fascist doctrine, and I will go into far more detail later in this video when we get to the topic of free speech. For now, it is sufficient to know that these are the frameworks they are operating from. That being said, some of the discontinuity can be attributed to the disparate nature of Antifa, since it isn't an organization in a traditional sense. Bray describes how, quote, depending on local context and politics, Antifa can variously be described as a kind of ideology, an identity, a tendency or a milieu, or an activity of self-defense, end quote. Ignoring his brutalization of the term self-defense for a moment, because I'll be addressing it later, everything else he said is essentially correct. This is part of the reason that discussion of Antifa at the public level has proved so difficult. Activists who engage in militant activities are obsessed with the fine lines between things like a mob, a crowd, and a bunch of individuals, and drift between these distinctions as it benefits them. So one day, the Antifa cell in a given city may be well organized and coordinated, and the next, spontaneous rogue actors sharing an ideological goal. That is why the best way to understand them is digging into that ideological motivation, so let's move on ahead to the meat of the book. The first 3 chapters of the book attempt to establish a rough chronology of the general anti-fascist movement, and while they are an interesting read, you'll have to forgive me for not spending too much time on them. The narrative Bray presents is all over the place, incredibly biased, and lacks any sense of scale or significance. He will shift from discussing events of international geopolitical significance to street scuffles between punks as if they are at all equivalent. And of course, everything he presents should be viewed through the lens of heavy skepticism, as I've already pointed out that Bray himself makes no claims of a neutral objectivity, and in fact assumes the typical postmodernist position that the past is nothing more than a tool for influencing the present. If there is anything major that should be taken from this general history of Antifa, it is that it has existed since the early days of the 20th century, and was for a while primarily a European phenomenon. Its transference to North America, at least in its current guise, is relatively modern. There were of course other militant far-left organizations in the United States and elsewhere before the anti-fascist action heraldry made its way across the pond, but they would have used other names. Many of the modern institutions will acknowledge connections to multiple groups, however, as these organizations are naturally porous, and many participants will change their stated affiliations as it suits them. Antifa is best conceptualized as more of an organizational structure than an organization proper. An Antifa cell is kind of like an army battalion, a set of organizational principles with a doctrinal way of applying force that can be raised or disbanded as the circumstances require. Now, where the first half of the book is too untrustworthy to be much use, Chapter 4 is actually quite illuminating because it reveals something that the anti-fascist and the left more broadly are typically reticent to admit. The chapter is structured in the form of 5 historical lessons that Bray believes that anti-fascists should consider, and they are 1. Fascist revolutions have never succeeded. Fascists gained power legally. 2. To varying degrees, many interwar anti-fascist leaders and theorists assumed that fascism was simply a variant of traditional counter-revolutionary politics. They did not take it seriously enough until it was too late. 3. For ideological and organizational reasons, socialist and communist leadership was often slower to accurately assess the threat of fascism and slower to advocate militant anti-fascist responses than their party's rank-and-file membership. 4. Fascism steals from left ideology, strategy, imagery, and culture. And 5. It doesn't take that many fascists to make fascism. These lessons are quite interesting, because they show that the anti-fascists actually have a better understanding of fascism than most liberals. They just also lie about it more. The 4th point puts this in the clearest language that the anti-fascists can muster. Bray says that fascism steals from the left, but an honest history of 20th century politics clearly demonstrates that in fact, fascism emerged from the left. That is to say, both Italian fascism and German National Socialism had their origins in the broader revolutionary movements of the time, and in practice were far more similar to the Soviet Union than the United States, Britain, or France. It's also worth pointing out that National Socialism isn't actually fascism. They are distinct political ideologies that weren't conflated with each other until well after Germany and Italy became allies. But this is a discussion for another time, and it isn't particularly relevant at the moment. Bray would certainly consider the Nazis fascist, but he would also call the United States fascist, which goes to show how he uses the word. Anything not of the left. Which, I should clarify, is not how I would label fascism, but I agree with Bray at least on that point, that fascism is not left-wing. But I wouldn't say they are on the right, either. The term third positionist was created for a reason. These movements sought to transcend the standard political divide through Hegelian dialectic, a full discussion of which would be interesting, but deserves its own treatment, which I may get to in the future. More than anything, I think it indicates the inadequacy of the left-right dichotomy. As while I would argue that fascism and Nazism aren't left-wing, they are both socialist. Some people say socialism is inherently left-wing, and thus National Socialism, not being left-wing, can't be socialist. I would say this is a case of trying to define reality using definitions instead of allowing definitions to be determined by reality. And the reality is that a worker in Eastern Germany probably wouldn't have seen all that much difference between 1940 and 1950. But again, something to cover in greater depth later. The important thing to take away at the moment is that whatever it became, both National Socialism and fascism definitely emerged from Marxist International Socialism, and this is why Bray lists points 2 and 3 as well. Part of the reason these movements were so initially successful is because they took large chunks of the existing revolutionary left-wing political class with them as a result of their formation. The existing orthodoxy would have initially seen them as just another socialist splinter group, not an existential threat. The rank and file wouldn't have viewed them like that either, but what Bray says about how it was this class that advocated militant action the soonest is probably true, because the early fascist groups were something far worse than just competition. They were heretics. And in the same way that there is no one more zealous than a convert, to the faithful, there is nothing more hated than an apostate. Point 5 is also somewhat of a confession, based on things like the Russian Revolution. Revolutionaries know that democracy is a sham, and that political power does not come from the people, it comes from force. Popular support is something that is manufactured later, after the levers of power have already been seized. That is what Bolsheviks did in Russia. They took advantage of the discontent with the progress of World War I and the Tsar more generally to navigate themselves into power. Popular support for Bolsheviks before the revolution was basically non-existent. This is why anti-fascists are so terrified of fascists, because they know that unlike liberals, a genuine fascist movement would use all of their worst tricks against them. But speaking of democracy, the great irony is that unlike the communists, the fascists actually did have large-scale popular support. Both Hitler and Mussolini were democratically elected using the framework of the existing system, which is what Bray is alluding to in the first point he mentions. He starts it by derisively mentioning that fascist revolutions have never succeeded. This is because they didn't really need to. Mussolini in particular, for most of his time as prime minister and later dictator of Italy, commanded an approval rating that most US presidents could only dream of. And while it cooled off during the war, he was never hated by the Italian people. And while it was true that he was killed in a lynching after the war, it was a Marxist group that killed him, not a popular uprising like is typically portrayed. This explains in part the revolutionary socialists' disdain for liberalism's political institutions. They see them as potential instruments for an ascendant fascism. Moving on to Chapter 5. Here, Bray dedicates an entire chapter to the topic of free speech and the issue of Antifa deplatforming speakers they deem fascist, like the famous 2017 incident of Milo Yiannopoulos at the University of California, Berkeley, which Bray leads with. He provides over a half dozen arguments, defenses, and deflections, but I would argue that they can all be separated into two piles based on the two ideological pillars we discussed earlier: arguments derived from neo-Marxism and arguments derived from postmodernism. Let me explain. Beginning with the Marxist arguments, we must understand how the great strength of Marxism is the concept of oppressor-oppressed dichotomization and the moral implications thereof. For the classical Marxist, the only such dichotomization that mattered was that of class between the bourgeois and the proletariat. The neo-Marxist, however, views this as only one axis among many, and creates a moral hierarchy based on varying levels of oppression. There can never be a neutral attribute, because the underlying goal of the various strands of progressivism more broadly is radical equity. Where there is difference, there is oppression. And that is exactly how the neo-Marxist drags free speech into question, by calling attention to the variance in a person's ability to be heard. Bray states, quote, "All non-incarcerated people may have a right to literally speak, but the ability to make that speech heard and make it matter is highly stratified." End quote. Neo-Marxist theory fundamentally rejects the idea of a neutral human right because of the existence of disparity in outcomes. Also, note his inclusion of the group he has concluded is most oppressed on this axis: incarcerated people, specifically granting them a form of holy reverence. They are a group without sin in this cosmology, and like all neo-Marxist chosen peoples, are granted that status not by personal virtue, but external factors. So this forms half of Bray's arguments defending Antifa's methods. He further expands on the point by arguing that fascism drastically reduces the ability of various oppressed peoples to be heard, and thus the anti-fascist is justified in deplatforming, doxing, canceling, and doing whatever they can to shut up their opposition because the net result is more people being heard. It's standard ends justify the means utilitarian calculus that strips humans down to their instrumental qualities. It's at the very least a very clever argument, but it only accounts for part of his case. So let's move on to the postmodernism. To begin with, when I'm describing something as postmodern, I'm referring to the position that there is no absolute truth or morality, only power and narrative. Antifa, and much of the left, adopts this position wholesale. This is perhaps best exemplified by a short exchange Bray had with a Dutch Antifa member named Job Polak, where Bray asked him if he thought he was violating people's freedom of speech. Bray records that Polak smirked and shrugged, replying that it was a, quote, non-argument that we never felt we should engage with. You have the right to speak, but you also have the right to be shut up. End quote. This is a pure and blatant appeal to power. We can do it, so we will do it. Now, my normal policy is to treat people as good faith actors until I'm given a reason to do otherwise, and that statement seems a pretty solid reason to do otherwise. Antifa is very blatant about their moral relativism, and even the neo-Marxist argument I presented earlier is merely the most convenient philosophical defense of their actions, freely discarded when it loses its convenience. It is for this reason that I'm not individually addressing all of Bray's arguments, because he does not actually believe them. Like a lawyer who will throw out a dozen different contradictory arguments to see what sticks, Bray is not trying to build up a coherent argument for Antifa, but lashing out against his critics in an attempt to use their own proclivities against them. As Frank Herbert said in Children of Dune, quote, "When I am weaker than you, I ask for freedom because that is according to your principles. When I am stronger than you, I take away your freedom because that is in accordance with my principles." End quote. Bray and Antifa more broadly are snakes, and should be called out as such. If more proof is needed, there is one more passage worth looking at. Bray addresses the accusation that Antifa, being revolutionary socialists, are in favor of utopia, and that utopia is impossible, thus undermining their argument that the ends justify the means. This is in fact a valid argument, because even if we accept the proposition that just about any means are justified if the end result is a real utopia, a demonstration that utopia is impossible would strip away that justification. But Bray completely ignores all of this. Instead, he states, quote, "Many will argue that utopia is simply impossible. Even if that were true, however, what is at issue here is the values being espoused, not their likelihood of being enacted." End quote. This is a surprising Calvinist take, an argument that Antifa are the pure and sinless anointed, and as long as they hold the correct beliefs, they can do no wrong. This is one of the reasons that the left is so obsessed with thought crime, because under this kind of theology, a thought crime is the only valid offense a holy person can make. It is what separates the true believer from the profane heretic. So with that in mind, the last chapter of the book and the follow-on appendices read as one would expect, a review of strategic considerations for anti-fascists to take into consideration in terms of application, not necessarily morals. I actually found this section of the book rather weak. I surmise because Bray probably didn't want to put anything more than an abstract approval for violence in print. For a more detailed look at left-wing activism and organizing more generally, I would suggest Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, a book I plan to review eventually. And in regards to Antifa strategy and tactics, I would advise looking at some of the sources I suggested at the beginning of this video. There is part of this chapter I think is worth looking at, however, and that is what I would argue is the most common Antifa defense for their use of violence, the so-called self-defense argument, because it is worth knowing. Bray actually presents 3 main arguments to justify violence, but the first 2 essentially boil down to non-violent methods don't always work, and violent methods do work. Again, pure utilitarianism. But the last argument goes something like this, in Bray's own words. Quote, "Fascist violence often necessitates self-defense. Although anti-fascists challenge conventional interpretations of self-defense, grounded in individualistic personal ethics, by legitimating offensive tactics in order to forestall the potential need for literal self-defense down the line." End quote. Essentially, Antifa believes in the preemptive first strike. I'm not even completely unsympathetic to this position. I would agree that there are times when potential threats need to be cut down before they can become an unmanageable problem. But note the language they couch it in. Instead of being upfront about their motives, they try to pass it off as self-defense. This relates back to the postmodern point I made earlier. They know exactly what they are doing, and know how ridiculous it is to describe this type of behavior as self-defense. But they also know that in our predominant liberal world order, self-defense is an affirmative defense that can justify violence. So they are attempting to twist the definition of the word to their benefit. They are appealing to our values while they are weak. Do not expect them to maintain them if they grow strong. Now, before we wrap up, I have a couple more general observations about the book and the Antifa movement more generally. The first is the importance that linguistic ambiguity plays in maintaining the Antifa movement. In Chapter 5, Bray states that, quote, "Anti-fascists don't oppose fascism because it is illiberal in the abstract, but because it promotes white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, ultranationalism, authoritarianism, and genocide." End quote. Essentially, he tries to present Antifa as engaged in practical politics, but instead of presenting a list of practical issues, he gives us a series of highly abstract terms that resist precise definition. Ask anyone what heteropatriarchy or ultranationalism is, and you'll get 11 different definitions from 10 different people, and probably different definitions from the same people on different days. Even genocide, which is seemingly the most concrete term he listed, can be surprisingly mercurial when used by leftists. Take the often mentioned transgenocide you hear about in modern discourse. Even a cursory investigation reveals that nothing of the sort is happening. But a literal massacre is not exactly what they are referring to. In this case, it's the concept of transness which they are concerned about. To a leftist, if a trans person is convinced to detransition, then they are a victim of transgenocide because the amount of transness in the world has gone down. It's not about actual killing, but they will utilize the colloquial definition of genocide and its association with atrocities like the Holocaust to their advantage to generate sympathy and be perceived as victims. It is for this reason that leftists are constantly spewing buzzwords like racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. They have very instrumental reasons for doing so. Many other commentators have pointed this out, and I have myself earlier in this video, and they are correct in doing so. The left plays word games for strategic and tactical reasons. But less people point out how many leftist movements don't just use ambiguous words, they need ambiguous words, and that is what I want to briefly touch on. So a quick illustrative thought experiment. In 1920, fascism was a new movement, and there were not any major anti-fascist movements. But an anti-fascist in 1930 had clearly defined purpose. There were now actual fascist movements in real positions of power. Move forward to 1940, and there is even greater clarity of purpose. Pick up a gun and fight for the Allies. You even have a choice between liberalism and communism. At this point in history, the anti-fascist has no need to spend time in deliberation about the abstract nature of fascism. They need only point themselves at the men calling themselves fascist and have at them. Move forward to 1950, and while the battle has been won, there is still a place for the anti-fascist. The survivors of those fascist regimes slink back into the shadows and were licking their wounds, ready to rise again. One more decade, 1960, and the anti-fascist is beginning to suffer from a lack of prey. Sure, there are still a handful of the old guard left in hiding, and a few young LARPers trying to be edgy, but the days of goose-stepping at Steak Hiles is long gone. Now, the entrepreneurial anti-fascist starts looking for the closeted fascist and the fascist adjacent. Skip to 1970, and this is his main industry. Those sneaky fascists with their dog whistles, some of them don't even realize they are fascist, but the anti-fascist knows how to spot them, and he's doing society a favor in doing so. Now 1980, and the anti-fascist is beginning to realize how fascism is connected to all kinds of nasty things. Racism, sexism, homophobia, the whole lot. There might be more fascists in the world than anyone ever realized. One more decade to 1990, and this is now a certainty. The world might think fascism is long dead, but the anti-fascist knows that they are everywhere. 2000 now, and the anti-fascist has learned to see fascism not as a people or a movement, but as a taint, the universal injustice that permeates all of society. Revolution is needed. 2010 and a coalition is built. It is not just enough to be anti-fascist, but anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-homophobic as well. Finally, 2020 arrives, and the anti-fascist looks back at World War II and now only sees fascist fighting fascist. Obviously, this is not an exact timeline, but it is meant to illustrate an important point. There was a time and a place where anti-fascism meant something very concrete. There were really fascist movements with real fascist armies and real fascist politics. But they were crushed, as thoroughly as any political movement in history. This left the dedicated anti-fascists with an identity crisis. Without tangible fascism, intangible fascism needed to be invented, and then projected onto the world. The left is by nature revolutionary, dedicated to change. When they achieve the change they desire, they cannot simply rest on their laurels. It is against their inclinations. So they redirect their energy towards something else, forever justifying their pursuit of reformation. The Antifa movement is no different. Should a rigorous definition of fascism be applied, and then Antifa limited only to fascism, they would be forced to disband, for there is simply not enough classical fascism left in the world to justify their activities. So it becomes necessary for them to cling to broad definitions for existential reasons, or else consign their own movement to ignominy. Now, my final observation would be how, devoid of all political trappings, the Antifa phenomenon, and those who make it up, can be seen as personifying the entropic principle for society. At one point early on, Bray mentions how many of those engaged in anti-fascist action also participate in such activities as labor organizing, squatting, environmental activism, anti-war mobilization, and migrant solidarity work. Regardless of your personal opinion about any of these activities, all of them seek to take advantage of a potential weakness in an existing power structure and siphon resources from it. Even anti-war mobilization, an activity which in some cases I would actually support, is in many instances either attempting to move resources away from the military-industrial complex to some other purpose, or simply erode the defensive capacity of a nation. None of these are constructive activities, even if you think the net result is positive. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that none of these activities are the kind that build anything. Destruction is not necessarily a bad thing. A gardener will trim rot from his plants to help them grow. A doctor will cut away infection to help a wound heal. And a society needs to eliminate corruption so that it may continue to progress. Anti-fascists, perhaps subconsciously, seem to view themselves as the embodiment of this role. In their minds, they are the karmic enforcers, little avatars of Shiva who will burn. In their minds, they are the karmic enforcers, little avatars of Shiva who will burn down the world in revolution so that utopia will grow from the ashes. They see fire as cleansing, and are not totally unfounded in that assertion. While I am loath to give them any validation, I can understand the Holy Crusader mindset that would lead one to aligning with Antifa. This does not absolve the fact they are overwhelmingly pathetic weasels with a warped view of reality, but it is still important to be able to understand how they came to such perspective. And while I believe that Antifa has contributed more bad than good in the world, since they have such a broad interpretation of fascism, they are correct in their underlying proposition that fascism is bad. If a bunch of Antifa punks and a group of neo-Nazi skinheads get into a gang fight, everything that results from it is basically a net positive for humanity. Thus, I don't really see the solution to Antifa being a political one. The question is more about how to direct individuals with a natural propensity for destruction. The answer is not easily, by their very anarchist nature. But it's a discussion that must be had, as there will always be elements of society that seek to tear everything down at the foundations. And I don't see those types of people as reachable through discourse. As Socrates would point out, we must determine if that which the gods love is pious, or if that which is pious the gods love. In other words, do people hate the world because they're Antifa, or do people become Antifa because they hate the world? Allowing for the possibility of both to be true, I think it is overwhelmingly the latter in most cases. And if that is the case, refuting Antifa doctrine is an exercise in futility, for it is not the doctrine which drives the destruction, it is the destruction which justifies itself with doctrine. Nonetheless, I think it is important to understand the doctrine, or else I would not have made this video. There may be those who are not predisposed to destruction, but find themselves ideologically committed to it because of works like Bray's. For people like that, discourse is still effective. Undercut their beliefs, and the destruction will go away. Even more common will be the fellow travelers, individuals who would never dream of committing domestic terrorism, but may be sympathetic and willing to lend emotional and material support to those who will. These are the individuals you are most likely to de-radicalize. So understand why they would find doctrine like this appealing, and then try to lead them away from a world of abstract principles and towards real issues. Most people have a gut feeling that Antifa is reprehensible. Let them know they are correct in their intuition. Well, that concludes this video. If you liked what I had to say, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, or subscribing to my channel. It would really help me out, especially in these early stages. I know I've been a long hiatus this year, but there should be regular content from this point on. Stay tuned for information of what to expect in the future. As always, thank you for watching, and goodbye.